I'm annoyed by your jealousy. It's just dinner with my boss. My wife told me, adjusting her shirt and hair. But when the waiter brought their check, there was a message from me. They started looking around in confusion. Mark Ellison did not raise his voice when his wife told him he was being ridiculous for questioning her dinner plans. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom while she adjusted her shirt, checked her hair in the mirror, and repeated that it was just a work dinner with her boss. Nothing more, nothing worth his tone. They had been married for 11 years and had 2 children, minus 1-year-old Ben and 4-year-old Sophie. And Mark had learned that conflict in their house usually ended not with resolution, but with exhaustion, so he stepped aside and let her leave. He helped the kids with dinner, explained that Mom was busy with work, and listened as Ben asked why Mom always dressed differently for work dinners than for work days. Mark answered that some people thought impressions mattered more at night. The question stayed with him after bedtime, because this was not the first dinner, and it was never scheduled, never mentioned until the afternoon, never followed by details afterward. Over the past month, Mark had noticed patterns that did not require imagination to connect. Charges from the same restaurant district appearing every few weeks. Lauren's phone staying on silent at home, but lighting up constantly when she stepped outside. Excuses that sounded complete only if no one asked follow-up questions. Mark did not accuse her of anything because accusations made people defensive, and defensiveness destroyed evidence. Instead, he verified what could be verified. He checked the shared bank account and confirmed the charges. He looked up the restaurant and recognized it immediately as the place he had taken her for anniversaries years earlier. He checked the company website and found her boss's photo, matching the name she always used when she needed conversations to end. By the time Lauren left the house that evening, Mark already knew where she was going and who she would be with. He did not follow her. He arrived before her. He spoke calmly to the restaurant manager, explained he would be dining separately, and asked for one small accommodation that required no explanation. He sat at the bar and waited. Lauren arrived 20 minutes later with her boss, smiling in a way Mark no longer recognized as casual. They were seated at a table with a clear view of the room. Mark watched without spying, because nothing was hidden. Their body language did not belong to colleagues discussing quarterly targets. It belonged to people comfortable in shared secrecy. They leaned in, laughed quietly, ignored their phones except when messages arrived that clearly mattered. Mark stayed where he was, ordered water, and waited for the dinner to end. When the waiter brought the check, he placed it between Lauren and the man, and with it a folded card Mark had already written earlier that day. Lauren reached for it automatically, then stopped when she saw handwriting she knew too well. The man looked around the room first, scanning faces, then focused on Lauren as if she might explain. She unfolded the card and read a short message referencing the shared account, the kids' bedtime, and a question about honesty that did not include anger or threats. Her expression changed immediately, not into guilt, but into calculation. She looked toward the entrance, then the mirrors, then the bar, trying to locate Mark without knowing where to look. Mark did not stand or wave. He watched as confusion settled in, as the man shifted uncomfortably, as the reality of being seen replaced the comfort of being hidden. Mark paid his own bill, left quietly, and drove home, knowing the real conversation would not happen tonight, but also knowing that the lie had already lost its balance, and that whatever came next would no longer be controlled by dismissal or accusations of jealousy. Mark did not confront Lauren the moment he walked into the house. He noticed first that her car was already in the driveway even though she had said she would be late, parked carelessly, slightly over the line, the way people park when they are distracted. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet for a place where someone had just arrived. Lauren was in the bedroom, speaking on the phone in a low voice, turning her back when she saw him. Mark didn't ask who it was. He didn't ask anything. He went straight to the closet and pulled down the spare suitcase they usually used for family trips. Lauren ended the call and asked what he was doing, already irritated, already defensive. Mark opened the suitcase on the bed and started folding her clothes. Not fast, Not angrily, slowly, shirts first, then pants, then a pair of shoes placed carefully at the bottom. The moment landed then, not because of what he said, but because he didn't say anything at all. Lauren laughed once and told him he was being dramatic, that this was insane, that it was just dinner and he was turning it into a crisis. Mark said he needed the house calm in the morning, and that this was the fastest way to make that happen. Lauren followed him as he moved through the room, her tone shifting as she realized he wasn't playing a role she recognized. She said he was humiliating her, that throwing her out would make him look controlling, that people would talk. Mark answered simply that people already talked. They just didn't do it to her face. She accused him of jealousy again, of insecurity, of not trusting her after all these years. Mark stopped folding for a moment and told her trust didn't disappear in one night. It disappeared in pieces, and he was done collecting them. When she tried to take clothes out of the suitcase, he closed it gently and told her the kids were asleep and he didn't want them waking up to raised voices or confusion. That slowed her down. She lowered her voice and asked if this was really how he wanted to handle it, if he wanted to scare the kids, if he planned to tell everyone she was some kind of villain. Mark said he wasn't telling anyone anything tonight and that the kids would be told only that Mom needed a few days elsewhere. Lauren said she wouldn't leave her own house. Mark said she could stay somewhere else temporarily or he would take the kids in the morning. But one way or another, the routine would be protected. That was the first time she looked genuinely uncertain. She asked where this was coming from, and Mark told her it came from the restaurant, the check, and the way she looked around the room when she realized someone else knew. Lauren went quiet for a few seconds, then said he was overreacting and that nothing had happened the way he was imagining. Mark didn't argue details. He said if nothing had happened, explaining would be easy, and instead she had chosen dismissal. He carried the suitcase to the front door and set it down, then brought out a second bag with toiletries and shoes. Lauren stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching, as if waiting for him to stop. He didn't. When he opened the door, he told her she could come back when she was ready to talk honestly, and that until then, this was a boundary, not a punishment. She left angry, slamming the door behind her, and Mark locked it without ceremony. Upstairs, he checked on Ben and Sophie, straightened a blanket, fixed a backpack strap, and sat on the edge of the bed longer than necessary. By morning, the house would feel different, and he knew the next steps would be harder. But at least the pretending had ended, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like the ground under his feet wasn't shifting anymore. The next morning started with a knock on the front door before the kids woke up, sharp and impatient, the kind that assumed it would be answered immediately. Mark opened it to find Lauren standing there with a small overnight bag, eyes tired, voice already tight as she said she needed to grab more things before work and that this situation was getting out of hand. The hook landed in what she didn't say. There was no apology, no explanation, only urgency and control. Mark stepped aside to avoid waking Ben and Sophie, reminding her quietly that mornings mattered now more than arguments. Lauren moved through the house quickly, collecting items while narrating her version of events out loud, insisting the dinner had been misread, that her boss was going through a divorce, that emotional support had been mistaken for something else. Mark listened without interrupting, noting how the story filled gaps she hadn't been asked to explain. When Ben appeared in the hallway rubbing his eyes, Lauren's tone softened instantly, kneeling to hug him and promise pancakes later. But Ben pulled back slightly and asked why she wasn't home last night like she said she would be. The question wasn't accusatory. It was confused, and it shifted the room in a way no adult argument could. Lauren answered too quickly, saying work got complicated, then stood up and told Mark they would talk later. Mark said later would need to include facts. She rolled her eyes and left with more bags than she'd arrived with, telling him he was making this harder than it needed to be. After school drop-off, Mark received a message from an unfamiliar number asking if he was the husband of Lauren Price. He recognized the area code from the hotel receipt and felt the day narrow. The woman introduced herself as the boss's wife and said she didn't want drama, only honesty. explaining she'd found messages that night that couldn't be explained away, and that seeing Mark's note on the check had confirmed her suspicions. She said she wasn't angry at him, only exhausted by lies that forced everyone to play a role. Mark replied that he felt the same and that the children were involved, which changed everything. She sent screenshots, not graphic, but clear enough to end any remaining doubt. Mark didn't forward them to Lauren. He saved them and closed the app, understanding that proof changed behavior faster than confrontation. That afternoon, Lauren's sister called, asking what was going on and suggesting Mark was overreacting, reminding him how sensitive Lauren was to judgment and how quickly rumors spread. Mark answered calmly that he was responding to actions, not rumors, and that stability for the kids was non-negotiable. The call ended awkwardly. At pickup, Sophie asked if Mom would be home tonight and Mark said not tonight, but they would fast a time before bed, keeping the answer small enough to hold. When Lauren called later, her voice was controlled, offering compromise, suggesting counseling before anyone did something irreversible. Mark asked if the counselor would hear the full story, including the dinners and messages. Lauren paused along and said it wasn't necessary to involve outsiders yet. Mark told her outsiders were already involved when Liz left the house. She accused him of trying to punish her, of aligning with strangers, of threatening her image as a mother. Mark said he was aligning with the truth and that her image would follow her choices. She warned him about court, about money, about how judges saw things, about how children suffered when parents escalated. Mark said children suffered when parents lied and expected them to pretend nothing changed. That night, Ben asked if parents could get in trouble for breaking promises, and Mark said adults face consequences when promises broke trust, and that the job of parents was to fix what they broke. Lauren didn't call again. Mark sat at the kitchen table after the kids slept and wrote a short list: routines to keep, boundaries to hold, steps to take. The affair was no longer a secret or a theory. It was a fact shaping the days ahead, and while fear hovered at the edges, there was also a strange relief in knowing that whatever came next would be built on something real instead of excuses that kept moving out of reach. The pressure arrived from places Mark had expected, and from a few he hadn't. Starting with a message from Lauren's mother early in the morning asking if they could talk like adults before things went too far. The hook was not the request itself, but the assumption behind it, that things had not already gone far simply because the truth hadn't been said out loud to the right people yet. Mark replied that they could talk after school hours and put his phone away so the kids wouldn't see it light up every few minutes. At breakfast, Ben asked if Mom would come to his game on Saturday, and Mark said he didn't know yet, choosing honesty over comfort even when it made the table quieter than usual. Sophie listened carefully and asked if Mom was mad at them, and Mark told her no, that this was about grown-up choices and not about love, repeating it until she nodded as if committing it to memory. By midday, Lauren called again, this time calmer, suggesting they meet somewhere neutral and reset the tone. Mark agreed, because avoiding didn't protect anyone anymore. They met at a small cafe near the school, chose a table in the back, and sat across from each other like people rehearsing how to appear reasonable. Lauren spoke first, saying she felt ambushed, that Mark's public move at the restaurant had crossed a line, that her boss's wife was unstable and trying to drag everyone down with her. Mark listened and then asked a simple question about the messages he had been sent, whether she denied writing them. Lauren didn't answer directly. She said context mattered, that emotional support blurred lines, that nothing had to mean what it looked like unless someone wanted it to. Mark pointed out that meaning wasn't assigned by desire. It was shaped by actions, and her actions had been hidden on purpose. Lauren's tone shifted, less defensive and more urgent. She talked about reputation, about the school, about parents who talked, about how judges reacted to conflict, about how quickly things could get ugly if lawyers got involved. She said he needed to think strategically, not emotionally. Mark said strategy was exactly what he was thinking about, which was why he had already spoken to a lawyer to understand his options and protect routines for the kids. The words landed hard. Lauren stared at him and asked if he was serious, then accused him of turning a mistake into a war. Mark corrected her, saying mistakes were admitted, and what she had done was manage damage until it stopped working. She leaned forward and lowered her voice, saying if he pushed this, she would fight, that she would not be painted as the bad parent, that she had friends, resources, and people willing to vouch for her. Mark said he believed her, and that was exactly why boundaries mattered now. The meeting ended without resolution. On the drive home, Mark felt the weight of what came next settle in, not as fear, but as responsibility. That evening, Lauren's sister called again, angrier this time, accusing Mark of tearing the family apart, of embarrassing Lauren publicly, of choosing pride over forgiveness. Mark said forgiveness required truth and time, neither of which he had been offered. When the kids FaceTimed Lauren before bed, she smiled brightly and promised weekend plans without confirming dates. And when the call ended, Sophie asked why Mom sounded different, like she was talking from far away. Mark said sometimes people did that when they were scared to be honest. Later, after the house was quiet, Mark reviewed the notes he had taken, the schedules he needed to keep stable, the steps his lawyer had outlined, and the messages he hadn't replied to. The situation was no longer about saving a marriage or winning an argument. It was about choosing what kind of ground his children would learn to stand on when adults failed them, and whether he would trade temporary peace for long-term confusion. He closed the notebook knowing the next move would force everything into the open, and that once it did, there would be no quiet way back to the life they had pretended still existed. The hearing was scheduled faster than Mark expected, not because anyone was eager for drama, but because routines involving children moved the system, whether the adults were ready or not. He took the morning off work, packed lunches the same way he always did, and drove Ben and Sophie to school without mentioning where he was going afterward. Ben asked if this was about Mom, and Mark said yes, but also said it was about making sure mornings stayed the same no matter what else changed. At the courthouse, Lauren arrived with her sister and a lawyer who spoke quietly and confidently, the kind of confidence built for rooms like this. She avoided Mark's eyes and focused on the paperwork, presenting herself as composed, inconvenienced, and misunderstood. When the judge asked why the children had been staying with Mark consistently for several days, Lauren explained it as temporary conflict management, saying emotions had run high after a work misunderstanding and that Mark had reacted impulsively. Mark listened and waited. When it was his turn, he spoke only about schedules, school pickups, bedtime routines, who attended games and appointments, and when absences had started. He did not describe the affair in dramatic terms. He described dates, messages, and decisions that required secrecy, and how those decisions had affected the household. When the screenshots were entered into record, Lauren stiffened, her lawyer objected briefly, and the judge asked whether the messages were authentic. Lauren did not answer immediately. The silence that followed was longer than it needed to be, and it carried more weight than denial would have. The judge asked about the children, and Mark described Sophie's questions, Ben's anxiety about promises, and the effort it took to keep routines stable without explaining adult failures too early. Lauren interrupted once to say Mark was manipulating sympathy, then stopped when the judge raised a hand and asked her to wait. The ruling was practical rather than emotional, shared custody structured around the children's school week, temporary primary residence with Mark to maintain continuity, and clear communication boundaries to reduce conflict. Outside the courtroom, Lauren accused Mark of humiliating her and choosing control over reconciliation, saying he had forced strangers into something that should have stayed private. Mark told her privacy ended when lies began affecting the kids, and that this was not punishment, it was containment. In the weeks that followed, the noise died down slowly. Some family members pulled away, others reached out awkwardly, unsure what version of the story they were allowed to acknowledge. Lauren struggled with the structure, missing pickups, asking for last-minute changes, bristling when flexibility was replaced with expectation. The children adjusted more easily than Mark had feared. Ben stopped asking whether plans would change and started checking the calendar instead. Sophie slept through the night again. Mark felt tired but steady, aware that nothing had been fixed, but something important had been stabilized. The moral arrived quietly, not as victory or revenge, but as clarity, that trust did not collapse because someone asked questions. It collapsed because answers were avoided, and that protecting children sometimes meant accepting being misunderstood by adults who preferred silence. Mark understood now that truth did not need volume to matter, only consistency, and that while the life he imagined had ended at a restaurant table, the life his children needed was still possible, built not on appearances, but on decisions that held even when no one was watching.